On April 26, 2024, the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal interviewed Dr. Ross Perlin, an invited speaker for the 2024 Apple Lecture Series hosted by the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Ross Perlin is a linguist, writer, and translator focused on exploring and supporting linguistic diversity. His book, Language City, was just released by Grove in the US and the UK. Since 2013, he has been co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance in New York, managing research projects on mapmaking, documentation, policy, and public programming for urban linguistic diversity. He also teaches linguistics at Columbia. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, and elsewhere, and his first book, Intern Nation: How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in a Brave New Economy, ignited national conversation about unpaid work. He has an MA in Language Documentation and Description from SOAS and a PhD in Linguistics from the University of Bern. We thank Dr. Perlin for his participation in this interview.
All right, so first of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Perlin. On behalf of the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal, we really appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with us.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, all of you guys.
So you have a broad background in endangered languages, from your dissertation work on Trung and Himalayan languages to the many disparate languages you currently focus on here in New York City. What has inspired you to take on this difficult area of research?
It's been a couple decades in the making now, so I kind of have to go back to the original impetus, which I think it's always important to sort of go back to that original impetus of what got you started. And I was certainly a lover of languages, somebody who wanted to study all the languages that I could. I mean, I grew up monolingually here in New York. There was a multilingual background. This incredibly linguistic diverse city that we'll be talking about was rising all around me, but I sort of began to throw myself into learning other languages without really looking at linguistics or understanding how linguistics fit into that. And of course, many people, if you're studying linguistics, will say, "Oh, you must just get to learn a lot of languages," not realizing that unfortunately perhaps is not always at the center of it. That there are all these other aspects to it. And as I talk about in Language City, it was the experience of studying Mandarin in an immersion program while I was an undergraduate in China, and going to a talk by a Chinese linguist named Sun Hongkai where I was really just trying to improve my Mandarin. I was like, okay, I'll go hear a linguist talk in Mandarin. It's just, I'll be straining myself, stretching myself. That he laid out his life's work, which was documenting endangered languages across China, which he began to tell us there were, over 300 minority languages of China, not even talking about all of the varieties of Sinitic, of which many know Cantonese, Fujianese, and so on, but there's many others. But these are completely separate languages, and that he had devoted his life for half a century to documenting these, and that this was not just him in China, but that this was a global phenomenon, that linguistic diversity went much deeper than most non-linguists really had any sense of, that there were over 7,000 languages in the world, that as many as half of those were endangered, and that precisely that half were the least documented, without dictionaries in most cases, without grammatical descriptions, without archival recordings, and so on. That kind of got me started. I really followed in his footsteps then, ending up doing my doctoral dissertation as a language documentation project on this Himalayan language in southwest China, and sort of finding my way into what was then a pretty new field, really kind of starting in the 1990s, of language documentation that was just sort of growing out of linguistics, which up to that point had always had some of this tradition in it, but had been really focused on generative grammar, the search for linguistic universals. This represented a kind of a newly organized movement on the part of linguists who, in some cases, were drawing more on anthropology, were inspired by a global indigenous rights movement, which was really building up, as well as sort of the uses of new technologies that were enabling different kind of field work and dissemination and analysis of results through the internet and so on. So it was really a kind of a tremendous moment, and I think now we're a few decades into this experience. Things have changed. We could talk about that, but Really, it was a moment of kind of finding my way to this new field that was growing up, and then after kind of entering it in sort of what was the standard way, which was to try to do kind of extended field work in an endangered language community. In many cases it would be like this on the other side of the world. I sort of realized, and then with the Endangered Language Alliance, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that you could sort of flip the script in a way and do that kind of work in a different way at home, as it were, with immigrant and diaspora communities in the place that you were living for the long term with an organization that kind of was committed to those kind of long-term partnerships. So that then kind of brings us to the last decade or so, which I try to document in the book, about the work of this organization, the Endangered Language Alliance, and what urban linguistic diversity looks like and endangered languages in this kind of context.
Thank you.
That's fantastic.
Mhm.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the Endangered Language Alliance? What's its mission?
The mission, in a word, is to document endangered languages and support linguistic diversity in New York City and beyond. But we could sort of unpack each of those terms and talk about it. It's a nonprofit, an independent nonprofit, founded in 2010, at a time when I was actually still in Southwest China. So it was founded by a linguist who's still now co-director along with me, Daniel Kaufman, a linguist named Juliette Blevins, as well as a poet named Bob Holman, and then this kind of assorted cast of linguists, language activists, language lovers who came together around this idea that New York had become this kind of unprecedentedly diverse city, although this is really not completely unique to New York. We can talk about other cities as well, and I think that New York is just a kind of bellwether or a paradigm case, but really this is something that's now everywhere, and urbanization is a major planetary fact of our time. So this was really the first organization, still in some ways the only organization, that was focused on endangered languages in cities and what could be done, trying to figure out what could be done. So I then came back here really just within a couple of years of the organization being founded, became co-director about a little over 10 years ago. And the mission has changed over time in certain ways. I mean, those words have always kind of been there, and it started certainly with this focus on documentation as a primary element, growing out of this field of language documentation, with the idea that there's a great deal to be done, and that what linguists especially can contribute often is that ability to create a dictionary, write a grammar, create a corpus of materials that, and then transcribe and translate them, and so on. But that sort of more academic side, which I think documentation is often fundamental to any other kind of language work, right? To prepare textbooks or children's books or other materials, you still need that sort of core of a documentation. But the mission has really grown and changed over time, depending on the interests of communities and language activists who have, in many cases, or most cases, really started the projects, come to us, with different desires, whether it's to document elders telling oral histories or traditional stories, or the desire to have a series of children's books, or to have a class at our space here in Manhattan. Or in recent years, a lot of things around language and health, which really kind of crested, and we can talk about with COVID, but actually did precede that as well. And language access, interpretation, sort of policy work has become more and more prominent as well. So it's been a real range of things. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that this is a giant organization. It's a shoestring operation. I think it is important that it is kind of its own independent space, even though we certainly, a lot of us have different affiliations and connections to universities and communities and other institutions, but it is kind of able to respond to the very different needs and situations of different language groups. And so that's kind of maybe more the support linguistic diversity piece. And then the New York and beyond, I think, is important because we're not, we're small, but New York is both a pretty concrete kind of space, but also obviously vast, as I document in the book. And we, for the most part, we want to be able to work in long-term partnership, person to person, closely over time. So, and there's enough to do here that we really, prioritize relationships at the local level with communities here, deep into the specificity of this city and its linguistic geography and different issues. But that said, there are all kinds of transnational or really like translocal connections between, not just the city, but particular neighborhoods here in the city or particular buildings to, a valley or a village on the other side of the world. And so sometimes that work does lead to us kind of returning, as I do in the book, to, or returning with a member of the community who's here to a place in Nepal or Tajikistan, or in other cases it's been Belize or Mexico, to sort of trace and do that kind of multi-sided translocal work. And then there are discussions also with linguists who are in, Toronto or LA or Berlin or Nairobi who are trying to do similar things in those places, but, from their knowledge and their context. So it is kind of global in one sense, but it's also very local as well.
Amazing. So how can linguists like us get more involved in supporting the Endangered Language Alliance?
Well, we are kind of open space. We are, we're limited by our resources on many levels, but we are kind of this big extended family that people sort of come in and out when they can. But we do have a lot of public-facing work. We do a lot of events. We're going to have an event series this summer, for instance, in August, where it would be great to see people. Sometimes there's, last year we had a monthly event basically, and then a little less so this year. It really has varied, but basically we are, particularly kind of always wanting to talk to language activists, linguists, community speakers, and basically almost in some ways function as a clearinghouse or a switchboard to connect people. So it's kind of like what we would want to know is, okay, what are you interested in? What are your skills, background? Does it connect with our general mission, right? There's a constellation of other organizations that are doing things for larger languages, especially. So sometimes people come to us and say, "Oh, I'm really interested in doing something around Spanish or something around, Cantonese or something like that, or even something around varieties of English." Super important work. It may certainly be kind of allied at a higher level, but it's probably, we would say, maybe connect with this or that in another organization. We're really trying to focus on situations and languages where there are not a lot of other work is being done. There aren't a lot of other resources. But in a word, I would say, reach out to us, be patient. We don't have, usually we don't have the capacity for a sort of regular volunteer or intern program or regular hiring, unfortunately. Like, we don't have that kind of staff to have those kinds of resources, but we are kind of this sort of platform that is open to different people to plug into. Usually, it requires both some patience and some initiative to kind of, find the right sort of intersection. But, if you're, if this is your jam, come to events, get involved, reach out, and let's find a way to connect.
Awesome. Thank you.
So now we'd like to ask you a couple of questions about your book. As you've mentioned, you've been working as co-director at the Endangered Language Alliance for over a decade. So what made you decide to write a book? And maybe you could speak a little bit about your inspiration for writing a book or your writing process.
So this book, Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, is a couple different things at once. It's a linguistic history of New York, the past, present, and future of the world's most linguistically diverse city, perhaps the most linguistically diverse city in history as far as has been really documented, and that's been documented through the work of the Endangered Language Alliance. So that's another component of the book is the story of this organization, this extended family, and how it came together, what we do, the day-to-day, what it actually kind of feels like, the texture of it. Another part, which I think we'll talk about, are the portraits of these six different speakers of endangered languages from different parts of the world who've come here, and like really just their lives, their languages, their experiences. But the book came about. It grew directly out of the work. I think it was long in my head that I wanted to sort of document the documenting in a way, because we've produced and put out and recorded an enormous amount of material in different forms. There's a growing digital archive with recordings in over 100 languages, with a lot of the most accessible stuff, at least, kind of up on YouTube and Facebook with subtitles and all of that. There's this digital language map we can talk about, which features over 700 languages at over 1,200 different sites around the metropolitan area, which is talked about in the book, but is also kind of its own massive kind of project or text that you can check out at languagemap.nyc. And then there are all these other components that I mentioned. There are these classes, children's books, events, all these things. But the book, I hope, kind of ties it together and also sort of shows what I think is a genre that I haven't seen before, of a kind of linguistic portrait of a city, like a linguistic biography of a city, which, I would love to read one for, Johannesburg, London, Jakarta, any number of cities. I'd love to just sort of see that kind of intersection of the urban and the linguistic. I think to some extent linguists, not sociolinguists, but certainly language documentation people, have not really thought enough about cities. They've been seen as places of kind of impurity, or it's just like language contact, or it's not really a place to work on language documentation or to hear like sort of the good speakers, as it's often thought of. And then on the other hand, like sociolinguistics takes off out of the city and is really about the urban context. Obviously has a deep connection to New York as well, starting with Lebov and those studies. So it's sort of in a way kind of bridging that gap a little bit, I hope. And I was kind of taking notes and thinking about this as we were doing the work, but I was generally so wrapped up in that day to day that while the research was there, it was I think in some ways it was with the 2016 election and then COVID kind of really hitting hardest multilingual immigrant communities in New York, to the point where that the height of things in 2020, it was for various reasons, right? These were essential workers, overcrowded housing, a number of factors, but also a linguistic dimension, a language access problem about interpretation and translation as when people needed it most. And when you got access to information in March 2020, if it was like a day or two difference with public health messaging coming out in English, and then maybe after that in Spanish, and then when was it coming out in Mixteco or Nahuatl? It was, if it ever did. So we then threw ourselves into that work. But, I also kind of saw through this the vulnerabilities of the city that we were working with and around, and that maybe my initial assumption back in 2013, 2014 was like, well, this language city is going to continually be diversifying more and more. There's going to be more and more here. Of course, we knew about the language endangerment was fueling our work, but and behind our thinking, but it was, I think that the sense that actually like immigration policy, public health emergencies, and all of these things could actually, sort of shift the entire ground under our feet, made it all the more sort of imperative to document the whole city, the picture of it in a single space, and kind of this moment, because as I end up talking about in the book, like, will this be peak diversity? Will we be able to sustain the languages that come here, or is this sort of a sieve that languages pass through?
Another question about your book is how, and you mentioned this earlier, so you chose 6 individuals to kind of portrait in the later chapters of your book. How did you end up deciding on those 6?
6 out of 700 plus languages that
Right.
we've documented on the map is a tough choice. And it really came down to the long-term relationships, the situations that I knew best, the people that I knew best. I should say that the 6 speakers who are featured speak between them over 30 different languages. So we're kind of, focusing on their mother tongues in the book, obviously, but these are extraordinarily multilingual people, as so many New Yorkers are, as most people historically in most of the world have been. And, that their multilingualism is something that I try to examine and spend time with and show how it's sort of structured and how it happened without formal schooling or Duolingo or anything like that. So yeah, there were some tough choices. On the one hand, like it felt fundamental to to show a range of languages from different parts of the world, but that also have a kind of special connection to this place, beginning with Lenape, the indigenous language of this land, and itself an endangered language, the story of which is in some sense almost the inverse of the story of the city's continual diversification, which Lenape speakers were actually successively displaced to the point where the last native speaker, as considered by many today, in her 80s, is in Ontario, hundreds of miles away. And I profile another woman from the tribe in Ontario who has been, until she passed away, as I was finishing the writing of the book, Karen, who is, I think, the first person to teach the language here in centuries, and to teach it in a classroom, to teach it at our center for several years. We come down every month. So it just felt essential to talk about Lenape. At the same time, to show different kinds of language situations, not just geographically, but also different strategies around language maintenance and documentation and development. So, everything from Irwin, a speaker of Nahuatl, who's a chef, who is sort of cooking through the Nahuatl language. This is the language of the Aztecs, a language that's deeply woven into Mexican culture and life, that gave us, the words taco and guacamole and tomato and chocolate and all of these. I mean, and he cooks through the words. So there's a kind of culinary linguistic connection. In the case of Ibrahima, who is a teacher and promoter of Nko, a relatively new writing system from West Africa meant to unite the Manding languages, a whole group of languages in West Africa. It was a story of writing and a story of technology, since he and other Nkomo, are really fixed on making sure that every new technological platform, starting with Unicode, which is fundamental for even any digital representation of a language, that Nko is there. And I think that's part of it enabled me to kind of talk about all the complex questions around technology and linguistic survival. We could go through each, but the basic idea, I think, of the 6 was to have sort of manageable portraits where you could get to know somebody, and these are people that I've known for years, and just, they're both kind of, in some ways, ordinary New Yorkers that you might pass on the street, but also really extraordinary people who represent, a variety of different approaches to and angles on these questions.
Yeah, so you've been talking a lot about endangered languages, and also in the title of your book, you use this term endangered, which really likens language to biological organisms. And linguists have drawn other sort of ecological metaphors between language and, let's say, using complex dynamic systems theory to study language as like an ecological system. So I wonder if you could say a little bit from your view, what are the parallels between language on the one hand and ecology on the other hand?
This is another one of the questions, I think, that drove the creation of language documentation as a subfield of linguistics in the 1990s, was inspiration and kind of frank use of metaphors and concepts from ecology and around biodiversity loss. There are, I think, a number of compelling and interesting parallels between biodiversity and linguistic diversity, starting with just clear historical and geographic linkages that many have noted, which is that there are high levels of diversity of plant and animal species precisely in the same regions of the world where there are high levels of linguistic diversity, this sort of hotspot model. There's not an even distribution of diversity, but actually kind of close connections. And, that is kind of a whole set of questions that I think are both widely acknowledged, but also sort of has not been substantiated and kind of delved into maybe as much as it might be. I think, it's clearly connected both with certain deep geographic factors like, islands and mountains are places where languages are. Certain like degrees of isolation combined with degrees of kind of interlocking and kind of membrane spaces where you can actually, there is both movement and enough kind of isolation to allow distinct cultures or distinct species to form. That said, that there isn't like a good clear mapping of like the idea of a language onto the idea of a species, and it's important to kind of, I think, tread carefully with some of the metaphors because and try not to use too many terms that kind of imply that a language is like a living being or a living species, and ideas of language death or extinction, which have sometimes been used in the past. I avoid that language because I find it kind of is more perhaps confusing and in some ways kind of, I think it's often kind of without a clear foundation, and then also is often not preferred by language activists themselves who see kind of more flexible futures with their languages and now talk sometimes in terms of sleeping languages or other metaphors that acknowledge the potential for revitalization. But that said, endangerment, I think, is still, I think it's a powerful kind of rallying cry, certainly. I think it also speaks to like some very real facts about the breaks in language transmission that are happening in so many communities, and we generally find that that's a term that kind of unites a wide range of people. But certainly, people also talk in different ways about indigenous languages, minority or minoritized languages, primarily oral languages, each of these vulnerable or threatened languages. Each of these terms has its issues, but also has its uses. But in terms of, more broadly, that there is kind of, even going back before the 1990s, a field of eco-linguistics and sort of talk of linguistic ecologies, recognizing the ways that languages don't sort of exist as it's sort of individuated entities, which is its own kind of question, but that really they exist in kind of situations of dynamic equilibrium and in kind of complexly structured patterns with each other that certainly when you think about multilingualism, when you look at a place like Queens, thinking in terms of like a language ecology approach, again it's sort of a metaphor and it's sort of learning from, frankly, the better sort of developed and longer standing work on ecology from a biological point of view. So I think that there's a lot that linguists can and have been learning from that, and there's a lot more that I would like to learn. And there have been some scholars on the linguistic side who've really sort of pushed these connections further, I think. And then the other thing that is just maybe I should have mentioned that's just really straightforward but really important is all of the botanical and biological knowledge that is encoded with and is inside and connected to linguistic knowledge. And particularly, what we call endangered languages, often speakers of these languages have the deep knowledge of their particular environments and, have the terminology, have developed the terminology and the knowledge, and, in many cases, naming species and phenomena before or ahead of any kind of scientific naming because of the deep connection between language and land.
All right, I'll go next. The concept of killer languages like English and Spanish is mentioned in your book. So can you explain how these dominant languages pose threats to linguistic diversity and what measures can be taken to mitigate these threats?
Killer languages is also is a bit of a, I use the term, it's been used a little bit by others. I use it kind of sparingly here and there, but I think of course it's a provocative term that is not meant to, again, suggest like directly kind of, or not meant to sort of push a directly kind of murderous image or anything like that, but is meant to highlight the way that speakers of larger languages and often, especially those who are kind of in positions of power in terms of standardizing and pushing versions of those larger languages, have really hounded the smaller languages, are hounding them out of existence. That smaller languages are not again, to just kind of try this metaphor, you're not dying a natural death. It's not, and again, that's this being imprecise, but just trying to kind of give a sense that, under normal circumstances that I think that linguists have observed, it's, parents and caregivers will pass on their mother tongue to the next generation. It's in situations of greatly distorted power relations that, and this is the larger conversation, well, what is endangering the world's languages today? Why are we saying this phrase "killer languages"? But it's because especially in recent centuries, all over the world, not just English and Spanish, but other large national languages have been sort of proclaimed as more correct, more standard, more modern, more useful. And speakers of the non-standard or the smaller or the primarily oral have been made to feel that what they're speaking is somehow broken or inadequate. And that message has come in many forms. It's come in residential school settings where native languages were beaten out of people. It's come in the form of legislation and language policy that has said you must speak this language on television and on the radio. It's come in the form of schools where you're just sort of given grammar books that tell you even implicitly like this is how you're supposed to speak. It's come in religious institutions. It's come in so many different forms, and it's to the point where speakers of the smaller languages, as it were, have internalized feelings of shame and inadequacy around their languages. And are choosing not to pass them on. I mean, there are also cases of course, of just entire groups being completely, decimated or displaced, and those also there are also those patterns as well. But a lot of what we're talking about today are these moments of language transmission where it might seem that a choice is being made, and people are like, well, it's just not practical to pass on my language, but there's a whole history behind those moments and those decisions. So, there are a variety of ways in which dominant languages are posing a threat to linguistic diversity. I think it kind of, today often boils down to the sort of language map of the world having, over 7,000 languages in it, and then the nation-state map of the world having about 200 nation-states. And the nation-state as the dominant form of human organization today. Although I kind of am hoping and trying to sort of suggest that cities might present some kind of countervailing force to that, but by and large, nations are kind of imposing one or a few national languages for their own reasons, and most of these nation states have come around in the last. Generally, this whole form has only kind of taken over everywhere in the last century or so. Obviously, we're also talking about the forces of capitalism, the forces that are changing the environment globally now. I mean, it's coming from a number of directions. But as to what can mitigate these threats, it's an ongoing global question. I think that the number of speakers alone is not sufficient. What we see now is that there are languages which may even have in the millions of speakers, but if transmission is broken, if there's not really a support system for a language, if those feelings of internalized shame are there, if technological access is not there, even they can be endangered. So I think to some extent what we need to look at is kind of the whole apparatus of support that vital languages have, all the way from everything from technological platforms to use in school systems to different sort of domains of use to a degree of documentation, rich resources, from the books as well as digital, and as many as half of the world's languages now have fewer than 10,000 speakers. So the scale is perhaps not going to be there, and there is and many languages historically were able to survive with relatively small speaker numbers, as I talk about in the book. But I think that it's going to vary in many cases. Obviously, in some situations, a language can stay strong with a pretty small speaker base if some of these other things do hold. But there's probably not one single answer. But I do hope that what overall will sort of mitigate the impact of the larger languages is a kind of thoroughgoing, kind of global revaluing of linguistic diversity, which I think is to some extent in progress, but there still are places where it's even illegal to speak a certain language. So we're in the sort of early days, I think, with this response, but language revitalization is now a really expanding field with hundreds of different projects happening from all over the world. We recently in New York hosted the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which happens every year, where language revitalization is kind of always towards the top of the agenda. That's where this current UN Decade of Indigenous Languages came out of, that body. And these may be sort of symbolic things on some level, but they do reflect the fact that you have a body of people and a body of experience of people all, from Wales to New Zealand to Oklahoma to Hawaii, who are all kind of working on these issues now.
Thank you so much.
So I'll ask you a question. I think you've already kind of started to touch on this, but in the first chapter of your book, you ask, and I'll quote, you say, "Can Babel, the real contemporary New York experiment, not the biblical myth, actually work?" And we're curious about how hopeful you feel currently about whether this Babel experiment will work and what needs to happen.
Perhaps the first step is kind of rethinking what this myth is all about, right? It's certainly the most familiar metaphor for a lot of people for linguistic diversity, and it's a negative one, right? It's seen as a curse that actually linguistic diversity was kind of this punishment for human hubris. But actually, I think there are a lot of other stories in a lot of other cultures about the origins of linguistic diversity that are a lot more promising. And there are even sort of some countervailing ideas in the book of Genesis as well, which where this myth actually seems to not be the only story. So I think there are a lot of living, breathing examples of linguistic diversity in action, and I hope that Language City kind of provides more in that way, and shows how contemporary New York in some ways is an extraordinary kind of case of a Babel in reverse, or of a kind of of a different way that linguistic diversity can survive and thrive. And it's not to say that it's every group kind of just completely siloed. It's about multilingualism. It's about lingua francas, that larger languages like English and Spanish being lingua francas, not imposed sort of top-down official languages necessarily, but obviously we need various ways to communicate, and historically multilingual ecologies have had that. But I guess part of what I mean in terms of thinking about this experiment is this idea of a linguistic infrastructure and sort of more formal ways we can support and actually kind of continue and grow everything that is sort of almost by happenstance in some ways. I mean, it's the linguistic diversity of cities like New York is obviously, it's a fact of contemporary urbanization, it's migration, it's economic, it's people being drawn to to resources. I mean, both push and pull factors. But as I said, then places like New York not really sort of doing much for it, and just kind of benefiting in many ways, but not really doing more to sort of grow it and to sustain it. So, to some extent, we're seeing promising developments in the areas of language policy at especially the city level in New York and other cities, compared to just 10, 20 years ago. Now, there are 10 so-called citywide languages, which at an official level, these are the largest languages, which have really, in each case, over 100,000 speakers. And it's a very particularly New York blend. It's, it's Bengali, it's Haitian Creole, it's Russian, it's, it speaks to who's here. And in many cases, these are second or third or fourth languages for people as well. So, there's that. And so that means, key documents are supposed to be translated into those languages, and each city agency is supposed to have a language access plan, it's supposed to have a language access coordinator. At the state level, actually, there's also recently an Office of Language Access has been set up. Other states are now considering it. I mean, there are some interesting things happening. They're very sort of small and initial, I think, given the scale of these questions. Likewise, bilingual education, right? There are now programs in this city in 13 different languages, dual language programs of some kind. And that ranges from a whole bunch of programs in Spanish to, I think one program in Japanese. But still, it's extraordinary compared to a couple of decades ago that now you can, send your kid to a Japanese-English dual language program in Brooklyn. And we're still seeing, what are the results of that? How are students coming out? What does that mean for languages? What about 3K and pre-K? There's also now programs in those. Presents a lot of interesting opportunities given the sort of language age issues and how important it is for these things to happen early. So, there's a lot that's going on that is really promising. But we'll see whether it's kind of equal to the challenge and these mounting challenges on the other side in terms of immigration policy, language loss back home, gentrification, and changes in terms of city life as well. Yeah, it's early days still.
Yeah, great. So for our last question, actually, we'll be picking up on language education in New York City. Many members of the Teachers College community, as well as attendees of tonight's lecture, are involved in language education. This really doesn't come of a surprise given the linguistic landscape we find ourselves in here in New York City, which is both a hub of language learning and language loss. So with your expertise in languages and your experiences with languages here in the New York City context, what message would you share with New York City language educators if you had the opportunity?
I want to learn from all of you guys. I think, members of the Teachers College community are in a pretty extraordinary position having this education, this institution, and then being in this city. It's super challenging. There are enough challenges, right, just in terms of like English language education, right, and then they multiply when, the challenges really kind of mount the more you're talking about under-resourced languages or primarily oral languages. So do the opportunities, though, and the potential benefits. I think certainly, I wish I knew more. I'm still trying to learn about the worlds of language pedagogy and teaching. I think obviously to some extent there has already been a great sea change that I'm sure is present here in terms of, not thinking in terms of prescriptivism, but descriptivism, and kind of seeing what are people actually doing, what are the actual needs, what are the actual linguistic practices, what does it mean to be in this sort of hotbed of language contact and language mixing and translanguaging that's happening kind of all around us, and it's happening in all the schools as well. And you have, in just the schools of the New York City public school system, you have right over 1 million students who are speaking hundreds of languages. And even we've had some discussions over the years with the city DOE, and I know there's some, they have language access coordinators, they have some of this kind of infrastructure now, but they even sort of acknowledged that, just the sort of intake data on the languages that people are, bringing to the school, that the parents speak, but they still really don't know a lot of, the way that data is better than what other city agencies have, and it's better than perhaps what the census has, but I don't think it, when we try to match it and look at it against the data that we've been collecting in our language map, you can see that there's still a huge gap, and there's still a lot that is not known about the actual language practices that students are bringing with them. So the more we can sort of discover and recognize that and sort of grow that and work with the language capacities that students and families have, I do think the better. Obviously, then the whole world of, this whole world of dual language education itself is one that so many groups I know want to become involved in, beyond just the largest that have these programs. And so the potential creation of new programs is huge, and will take a lot of work and knowledge from educators and people who are involved with TESOL and with Applied Linguistics. There's a lot, right? and it's really, it's about the sort of the resources, the time. I think, having language teachers and language materials are huge bottlenecks for a lot of the language revitalization programs and language activists. These are requests that we get a lot. We want to teach our language in the community. How do we go about doing that? Traditionally, of course, language transmission and teaching were able to happen without a lot of formal pedagogical, classroom time. But given the realities of life today, increasingly more and more languages are sort of coming to the classroom, looking for the classroom and looking for education systems to help sustain them. And even feel often, I think there's a feeling in many cases that, education, the educational world has often been a sort of a negative force associated with dominant languages, but that actually could be, and should be in some ways reversed, and there's the potential to flip that. So there's a huge amount that needs to be done. I want to know more. I really am learning a lot about what learning looks like. So I think that, I hope that we can all make these connections.
Awesome. Thank you again, Dr. Perlin, for taking the time to speak with us today. We all really appreciate it, and we've definitely learned a lot. And we're really looking forward to your lecture tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks so
much.
much.